Hello, good afternoon again from the World Health Organization headquarters in Geneva. Like every Wednesday, we are here to answer your questions about COVID-19. My name is Alexandra Kuzmanovic, and as vaccines have been seen as a light at the end of the long tunnel of the fight against COVID-19, today we will talk about vaccines, but also therapeutics and diagnostics safety and how WHO is assessing and approving those products. I'm pleased to be joined by two ladies today, our Chief Scientist, Dr. Soumya Swaminathan, and our Assistant Director General for Access to Medicines, Vaccines and Pharmaceuticals, Dr. Mariângela Simão. Good afternoon, and thank you for being with us today. I will just invite our users to ask their questions if they're watching us on Twitter by using hashtag AskWHO as usual. But if you're watching us on Facebook, LinkedIn, or YouTube, please ask your questions via comment section. And please have in mind that we will curate the questions to take those that are relevant about vaccines, therapeutics, and diagnostics on COVID-19. Before the questions start coming in, Dr. Soumya, can you maybe update our viewers on all the scientific work that has been done in the past year to develop COVID vaccines and, of course, to ensure that they are safe and effective?
Sure. So right at the beginning, as soon as we recognized that the pandemic was due to this new virus, the SARS-CoV-2, we also knew at that time that the solutions were going to come from science, that the world was going to look to scientists to develop the tools, the diagnostic tests, the new drugs, therapeutics, the vaccines, and other products that are needed to treat these patients. So we convened scientists from all over the world, private sector, public sector, the big research funders, the government agencies that do research, and in the middle of February came out with a research roadmap. And one element or one work stream there was really on vaccines. And we recognized that here's a new pathogen, a new virus. You need to develop a vaccine or vaccines for this virus. What do you need actually to get that going? So you need, first of all, in the lab, some standardization of what tests you're going to use, what animal models you're going to use, what assays you're going to use to test immunity, because after all, the vaccine is tested by the immunity that it generates. So we have the antibodies, different kinds of antibodies, and we also have something called T-cell immunity. So it was important to define all of those so that all developers, are using the same assays, and so we compare apples with apples. And in fact, Dr. Simão's team on biological standardization has recently approved some standards for the assays to be used. And that's the normative function of WHO. Then we went on to develop model protocols or template protocols, because it's really important that when you do a vaccine trial, that it should be tested. Of course, it goes through different phases. The phase 1, which basically looks at safety. Then you get into phase 2, which is in a few hundred people looking at immunogenicity, that's how good an immune response it elicits, and safety. Then you go to a large phase 3 trial, and we estimated that the size of the trial should be between 25 to 30,000 people. Half of them would get the vaccine, the other half would get a placebo. And then you follow them up for at least 1 year to look both for efficacy and the duration of protection and safety. So we put out these model protocols, and we convened a number of expert groups to advise on this. And we also have the Solidarity Trial Protocol, which would allow us to test many different vaccine candidates against one common placebo. And finally, we are maintaining a landscape of vaccine development, and it's really incredible. I think on latest, when I looked at it a few days ago, we had something like 65 vaccine candidates in clinical phases of testing. 15 of them were in the late stage, phase 3, and another 170 or so preclinical development. So yes, one other important thing we did was to define the target product profile. That basically means what are the ideal properties or characteristics of a vaccine. Somebody is developing a vaccine, and we set those benchmarks at 50% minimum efficacy, ideally above 70%, should be safe in different groups of people, including pregnant women. ideally should be given at single dose, but if not 2 doses, ideally should provide long-term protection for several years, should be stored at a room temperature or in the fridge, should be easy to scale and manufacture, should be affordable. So there are all these properties that you would want an ideal vaccine. You aim for that. Should be given by non-injectable, so a nasal vaccine, for example, or other mode of administration. So those are all the things that WHO did starting from very early on to encourage vaccine developers, and then we're helping and tracking them. And of course, we work with CEPI, the Coalition for Epidemic Preparedness Innovation. They're part of the ACT Accelerator. They promote R&D. They're funding a number of companies to develop vaccines. And we were very encouraged to see the progress that's been made.
Thank you so much. Our viewers are also very interested in the approvals processes and the data that WHO is looking after the phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, and then when the vaccine is questioned whether it can be used massively. So what are the data that WHO is looking at to assess if the vaccine is safe to be used worldwide? And do we have any mechanisms in place where countries are sharing this information with each other?
That's really important, because I think what we want to promote also is transparency. As I mentioned, we have these target product profiles. And so what we look at is efficacy. So you want a vaccine, as I said, ideal efficacy we had defined as over 70%, but a minimum efficacy of 50%, which means that it should, if you give it to 100 people, at least 50% of them should be protected from getting a symptomatic disease or severe disease. Then we also set some statistical boundaries around that, it shouldn't go less than 30% and so on. Then the safety, short-term and longer-term safety is important. And then there are many other features of a vaccine that look at the quality of the manufacturing practices, the lot-to-lot variation, and those are things which our regulatory team regularly assesses. So we start looking at data from early stage onwards, because right from phase 2, you start getting an idea of, is this vaccine candidate really eliciting the kind of antibodies or immune response you want? And that gives you some encouraging information, but ultimately it's only the phase 3 trial. What we want to see is prevention of disease. Prevention of infection is another question, but that is a secondary, it would be ideal to have a vaccine which produces such good immunity that you neither get infected nor you get disease. But we use a lot of vaccines now, like influenza vaccine is a good example of a vaccine that does not prevent infection, but it prevents severe disease. And so it protects people from death, it protects people from getting bad pneumonias. And so that's the kind of data that we look at, right, Mariângela?
And the other thing is that it's not over when you finalize what we call the phase 3 trials, right? Because then like Dr. Soumya was saying, you need the national regulatory authority or a regulatory authority or WHO need to assess if the process to produce the vaccine is well done, right? What we call the good manufacturing practices. So it's not enough to do the trial, you also need to prove that we have everything in place to make sure that what goes out of the factory is actually of good quality, right? And then there's another piece of work that's already ongoing, and I think it's addressing your question about what happens after, right? Because the safety work, the surveillance, looking at the potential side effects, right? We call it adverse events. The side effects goes on, right? Because you test the vaccine a large number of people, and then you use it in an even larger number of people. So we have a network, and WHO has a global advisory group on a committee on vaccine safety, but we also rely on a network of countries who provide information if any unexpected side effect, severe side effect comes up. So it's not over when it goes. It has to be registered at the country level, right? There are several, until it reaches your arm, until you get vaccinated, there are several steps that are taken care of for you, to make sure that you get the best vaccine, the safest, and potentially the most effective.
Thank you very much. And I'm glad you mentioned, because a lot of our followers, not just who are watching us now, but when we share information about new vaccines, they are questioning, do we know if there are any side effects of the currently approved vaccines? So what happens, as you said, we continue with surveillance and following the vaccination. So what happens if we notice that there are side effects and that they are affecting more people? Are there any actions that WHO takes in that case?
First of all, let me say that we have one vaccine that's been widely used in the market, which is the Pfizer vaccine. We have not observed any deaths, and actually with any of the vaccines that are being used at the moment, right? So what happens once we keep what we call, it's like a surveillance system, an information that goes between the different regulatory authorities and WHO, right? And then we get informed if severe side effects appear anywhere, and we have seen a little bit, some cases of, and this is on the media as well, on what we call an anaphylactic reaction, because some people have already a predisposition and have a history of having had severe allergies. You know what an anaphylactic reaction means? That your body reacted very strongly against medicine, a food, or any other product. So if you have a history, one of the recommendations is to always use these vaccines in the healthcare setting that has conditions to address if you develop any more severe side effect. So there's a system in place. The recommendations, WHO does issue recommendations for the use of vaccines. WHO has a strategic advisory group on immunization that issued recommendations for the Pfizer vaccine. Is already meeting for another vaccine quite soon, I think this week or next week. So health workers and the health services, the ministries of health, usually follow WHO's recommendations in which type of population, which are the most common side effects, and which are the conditions that have to be in place in order to secure a safe delivery of deployment of the vaccine.
Thank you very much. Maybe we can clarify this, because you mentioned there is only one vaccine so far approved by WHO for emergency use, but on national level, some countries have approved few vaccines. So can you tell us about this process? What does it mean when WHO approves a vaccine for emergency use, and why do we need to do it on a national level and then WHO as well?
First of all, any country that has a legislation that allows it to use, for example, an emergency use authorization, why do you differentiate? Because usually countries have legislations that that set the regulations how a product entered the market in the country, a health product, be it a medicine, a vaccine, or diagnostic. It has to be registered, licensed by the National Regulatory Authority, right? Now, in emergency situations, like we are living right now, but we live through other emergency situations, countries have to have in their legislation a legal provision to issue an emergency use authorization in case you don't have all the data that you would usually ask the manufacturers to present, right? So this is what it is, an emergency use authorization, how it's different from a registration or a licensing. WHO does the same. WHO published, I think was in September of October, the criteria by which it would assess the products that came for WHO for assessment, and how they would be judged, to be safe and effective, and what would be the criteria for WHO to include the vaccine candidate in the WHO emergency use. Why is it important? Two things. First, because international procurement agencies, for example, UNICEF buys a lot of vaccines for many, many countries, right? UNICEF uses WHO like seal of approval to buy vaccines. PAHO does the same. So it's important for international procurement. The second reason why it's important is because we have a great variety of the stages of maturity of the national regulatory authorities. We have maybe around 100 countries where the national regulatory authority is not mature enough yet to do assessments on vaccines, right? So they rely on WHO's work, to be able to register, to authorize it in the country, in their country. So this is the reason why it's very important to have WHO assessment. You mentioned we have one vaccine so far listed, but we have already 3 more on the final phase to be assessed for the listing. We have 2 more that are still submitting data for WHO. In total, we have 13 vaccine candidates, 12 now because one was listed, that are going to be assessed by WHO. That's the stage we are in right now.
Thank you very much. And are there any other vaccines besides these 13 that WHO one approved and is reviewing? Are there any new that are still in trial phases that we may expect more vaccines to come against this disease?
Yes, there are several. As I said, we know of at least 65 which are in clinical trials already. So over the next several months, we will get results from clinical trials of other vaccines. And the question is, why do we need so many? Because the properties of each of these vaccines is a little bit different. The first vaccine to go out, the Pfizer vaccine, which showed a very high efficacy in the clinical trials, it's a new platform technology, the mRNA vaccine. The drawback is that it requires an ultra-cold chain. It requires, very low temperatures, -70, -80 degrees to be stored. That's a problem in many countries. So there are other vaccines in development which may be effective with a single dose. There's one in development that's a nasal vaccine. It may be possible to give it through inhalation. And so there are vaccines in development which could actually be scaled up at a much more affordable cost. So there may be many vaccines that have advantages over the first generation. So I think we also need billions of doses. We have to remember that this is the first time the world is trying to vaccinate, 70% of the population of the world. We generally focus on children and we focus on a few adult vaccines. So we do need both the variety of vaccines. We need to expand manufacturing capacity and scale so that we can distribute these vaccines to all countries as quickly as possible and achieve that coverage that we want.
Thank you very much. We have a lot of questions coming in already, so I will start reading some of those. Samuel Nair, who is watching us on Twitter, is asking, a vaccine takes 10 years to develop and COVID-19 vaccines have been developed in 1 year. How will the people be given an assurance that they won't be affected health-wise from the vaccine? I think you responded this question earlier when we started talking about COVID vaccines, but I think it's worth explaining again how science has advanced so fast in this case.
Yeah, I think it's an important question, so worth emphasizing that it's not by cutting corners and it's not by skipping any steps. All the steps, and Mariângela was explaining also that even after the clinical trial there are steps to be done. The way the timelines have been compressed are like 3 or 4 things. One is that these platforms have been developed over the last few years, these mRNA platforms and this new viral vector platforms, the adenovirus. These are all investments that have been made for Zika, for Ebola, for some of the other pathogens. So labs around the world were quickly able to take the genome sequence of this virus and put it onto these platforms. So that's where the science and technology comes in. Secondly, a huge amount of funding has been put into developing, which means that you can move very fast from one phase to another. Normally, companies will wait for one phase, see if it's successful, then raise funds for the next phase. So that was compressed, and there's been a lot of public-private collaboration in many countries where the public sector has stepped up, both with funding, but also to do clinical trials, and collaborating with the private sector. The third is that manufacturing scale-up, which again usually happens at the end of phase 3. Once all the results are there, then only companies start scaling. But here, investments were made, and they were also made by the COVAX, by CEPI, and by many governments and private sector themselves to start manufacturing doses even before you knew whether they're effective or not. So if they were not effective, of course, that investment would then have to be repurposed for something else. But that has allowed a vaccine to start being used literally within days of it showing that it's effective. And finally, I think on the regulatory side, there's been a lot of alignment globally. And WHO has again been in the center of that, so that all the regulatory agencies, are talking to each other. They are aligning on the benchmarks, on the rules, so that everyone moves as fast as possible. So those are the ways.
Thank you. Please go ahead.
No, because there's another factor, because we have so many patients right now, right? So it was easier also to get volunteers for the trials, because sometimes it takes a long time, and we are seeing that with, for example, with the therapeutics against COVID, we are seeing that the profile of the volunteer that you look for example, for an injectable monoclonal antibody, which is one of these new biological drugs that's being developed for COVID. If you're going to ask a person who's not feeling sick to get an intravenous injection, they don't want to do it, right? So you have problems getting volunteers to do these trials. On the vaccine side, on the other hand, you had volunteers, you could reach the numbers for phase 3 trials quite quickly. That doesn't happen normally, right, in normal circumstances.
Thank you very much. And I'm glad that you mentioned, Mariângela, also therapeutics. And I think it's important to give an update where we are with other tools when it comes to development, safety assessment, and approvals phase when it comes to diagnostics and also therapeutics. What's the latest information? And also maybe to remind on the process how we do this when we approve these products. Does it work the same way like with vaccines, or we have some different processes?
So on the research side, we've been doing a very similar process with the therapeutics. We've been tracking, identifying promising candidates. We set up the Solidarity Therapeutics trial, and the goal was exactly as Mariângela said, if you have centers in many, many countries enrolling patients, you can go very fast, and you can move to where the disease is raging, so that you get a lot of participants for the trials. And so the first phase of Solidarity looked at repurposed drugs. So repurposed is drugs that have been used for other diseases, other viral infections, other anti-inflammatories. You test them for this disease because you can move very quickly on those. They're already licensed and approved drugs. Unfortunately, none of them really turned out to be very useful, at least not in reducing deaths or reducing hospitalization. Now there's work going on a couple of different therapeutics. One are the monoclonal antibodies. Mariângela mentioned, these are specialized antibodies against the virus. You give them very early in the phase of the disease. You can prevent the disease from progressing. So these are still under trials, but they look promising. The downside of monoclonal antibodies is it's very difficult to scale production in large volumes. And it's mostly expensive, and manufacturing in the developing world is not there. Then there are antivirals, which directly attack the virus. You need to give that early in the course of the disease. We've also understood more about the disease, right? So it's not that the virus kills because the virus is multiplying, but what it does, it stimulates an immune response in the body in some people, who then, where the immune system starts attacking the body's person's lungs and the person's other organs. And that's what makes them really sick. So anti-inflammatory drugs, the dexamethasone was proven to be effective. That's in fact the only drug that WHO recommends now for treatment. But there are a number of others, anti-inflammatory drugs, immunomodulatory drugs. All of them are in the clinical trial. So there's a lot of research going on. But apart from dexamethasone, unfortunately, no other drug has really been found to be extremely useful in reducing mortality.
Thank you very much. And maybe, Mariângela, you can update if we have any, or just to remind the viewers on the test and diagnostics, because there were some new tests developed as well to identify the COVID-19 virus. So how do we approve that the tests are actually accurate and could be used?
That's a good question, too, because there's a lot of products in the market right now, right? And what's the choice, especially if it's a policy, governmental policy? How do they assess the quality to see that it doesn't give, for example, too many positive results when it's negative, or doesn't give too many negative results when it's positive, right? So that's the basics in plain language. How do you make sure that you have the best diagnostic to assess either if you have antibodies, because there are some tests in the market now to see if you had COVID or not, right? To see if you have COVID now, right? And there are different tests. What does WHO do? We do also an emergency use authorization for these tests. So the companies, they send to WHO their dossier, and we assess. And then we have this gold standard, which is this PCR test, which is the nasal that nobody likes, but it actually, I don't know, people complain, but it takes like 2 seconds, so we have much worse things that take much longer than 2 seconds, right? So WHO assesses, compares the different tests, how they are manufactured, and the different results they show in the trials they did and on the research they have done. So WHO has many tests that have been listed. WHO calls it a listing, has been listed for emergency use. And these include also what we call the rapid tests that can be used, what we say when we say at the point of care, which means can be used in your doctor's office, or can be used at the health centers, or at the emergency ward, that will help the health workers to make a quick decision. So WHO has listed several of these diagnostics. I don't know if you want to complement.
No, I think you're right. And we have a number of different types of diagnostics, as you said, which is useful. And there's a lot of innovation going on. So I think we will also see more affordable, easy to use testing. Some countries are even thinking about home testing, mass testing in educational institutions or in other places where people congregate. But it's really important. Diagnostics play such an important role. And I remember, way back in February of 2020, on the whole continent of Africa, there were 2 labs that could do the RT-PCR test. Today, of course, there's much more capacity to do the RT-PCR, but also availability of the rapid diagnostic tests.
Can I compliment just because there's something very interesting. When you have a test and it comes negative, you feel very confident, right? And that's dangerous, right? Mm-hmm. And I'm saying that because it happened a lot with HIV. I had a test, so I'm negative, so I don't need to worry. No, you need to continue to do the prevention, right? You tested negative, good for you, but don't lower down your guard, because it's not over. The virus is circulating in many communities in high numbers. So the test doesn't, it's not a diagnostic test, is not a prevention measure, right?
Thank you. And we were talking about different products, vaccine, tests, therapeutics, and you said it well. It's we as WHO have given, and countries are giving, emergency use listing or emergency use approval. So what's the difference between this emergency use approval and the regular approval for any medical product?
It's because it's the amount of information that you have about the product, right? Because we are, the products we like we said, we fast track, but there are no cutting corners, right? Everything was done by the book according to the international norms and standards for the products. When these products are used, but for us to have the entire thing, how long, for example, a vaccine, you would need to know how long is the immunity, for example. When we say the immunity, it's how long are you protected against severe disease or against transmission and so on. This takes time that we don't have right now. Then you use an emergency use approval with the quality criteria that has been established before, and with time you complete the information that's needed, and then the product is either licensed at country level, or in WHO we call it a pre-qualification, a pre-qualified product. So it's just a matter of timing and the amount of information, scientific information you can gather. I don't know if you want to.
Thank you very much. I think, Soumya, this is a follow-up to your statement that we expect or we want to vaccinate 70% of population to stop this pandemic. So Ludmila Spasova, watching us on Facebook, is asking, why do you want to vaccinate so many people?
Okay, yeah, that's a good question. And the goals of vaccination are to, first of all, is to reduce the mortality. So the first lot of people we want to protect are those that are at highest risk of getting infection and at the highest risk of death. And that's why healthcare workers, frontline workers, and the elderly have been prioritized. The second goal, of course, is to bring an end to this pandemic. We do want to stop this virus from spreading from one person to the other. And that's when this concept of herd immunity, some people call it, or population immunity, comes in. And we've seen that in other viral infections as well. So if you have a certain percentage of the population that is immune or cannot get sick with this because of the vaccine-induced immunity, then you can actually stop the virus from spreading from one person to another. And so the goal really is, for example, for measles, we know that you need to vaccinate at least 95% of children in order to stop measles transmission in a community. That's because measles is a highly infectious virus. So the more highly infectious the virus, the larger the percentage of the population you need to cover. In this case, we think that the RT, the rate at which this virus transmits, is somewhere between 2.5 to 3. And of course, it depends from one situation to another. It could vary. And that's where this figure of about 70%, over 70% comes from. It could be that it's closer to 80% as well. But again, we need to wait and see the impact of the vaccines. And I think we're going to learn quite quickly from those countries that have now started vaccinating their populations, to see how quickly the transmission to the close contacts comes down. And then we will learn about how effective this vaccine is actually in preventing the spread of infection from person to person. As I mentioned, some vaccines produce sterilizing immunity. They stop infection, they prevent disease. Some vaccines do not stop infection but prevent disease. And at this point of time, we're still waiting to see the results of the studies to know which of the COVID vaccines are actually going to prevent infection successfully. But hopefully they should.
Thank you very much. Our LinkedIn viewer is asking, may you please comment on the long-term safety tests performed on COVID-19 vaccines?
Sorry, I didn't understand.
Can you please comment on the long-term safety tests performed on COVID vaccines?
Well, it's a good question, but the long term here is just a few months. So you're absolutely right. Normally, the clinical trials would last for, a year or 2 years. Because of the pandemic and the emergency situation, the regulators agreed that 2 months of safety data would be good enough, along with the efficacy data, to provide an emergency use authorization or listing. What is going to be necessary is for each of the manufacturers to continue to follow up people, both in the clinical trials and those who are getting vaccines in countries, and periodically update the safety profile. And that's what Mariângela was talking about earlier, that we will continue to look at the safety profile, we continue to collect data on that, and it's only after a reasonable period of time, maybe a year or so, that these vaccines will get full authorization. Till then, they are going to be on the emergency use listing.
Thank you very much. Here's the next question as well, coming from our viewer on LinkedIn. Are any of currently used COVID-19 vaccines safe or can be used for people with autoimmune diseases? Or are there any treatment for people with autoimmune diseases?
So at this point of time, there are no contraindications for these vaccines for people who have autoimmune diseases or immunosuppressive conditions. However, it's best that these people consult their local doctor, because different vaccines are being used in different countries, and the exact disease and the exact clinical status of the person will be known to the doctor. So it will be a good idea to discuss before actually taking the vaccine. But it's not an absolute contraindication. In fact, even pregnancy, even though a large number of pregnant women have not been tested, there have been few pregnancies in the clinical trials. No untoward effects have been found. So the recommendation from WHO is that you have to do a risk-benefit. If you're a healthcare worker, a frontline worker who's at high risk of getting the infection, then it's probably more beneficial to get the vaccine than to not get it. So in some circumstances, it's a risk-benefit assessment, and the best person to do it would be the local doctor, healthcare provider.
Thank you very much. Here is the next question from Twitter. Are COVID-19 vaccines safe for those who are having COVID-19 infection with no symptoms?
Yes, it should be safe. And again, we're waiting for an analysis of the data from the trials, because when the trials were enrolling, they had enrolled people with negative PCR test, but some of them had asymptomatic infection, which was not picked up. Some of them were antibody positive. So as we see more analysis coming out, we will know, what happens when you give a vaccine to somebody who's already had infection. But so far, there are no safety signals. There's nothing to worry there.
Thank you very much. And here's a good question about distribution of vaccines. Do you have any timeline for the rollout of these vaccines throughout the world?
That's in everybody's mind right now, right? Because we had, the other day I was saying that we wish we were living through a different situation, because we've been working very hard to ensure that all countries in all populations do have the opportunity to access these vaccines. In what we have seen so far is that I think we have now 50 countries that have started, right? And 44 or 42 are high-income countries, which means developed countries. And it's a situation where you have, if we leave it for each country to look for, bilateral agreements on its own, it's a no-go situation. That's why since the beginning, since last year, we've been working very hard. WHO, Gavi, which is the Vaccine Alliance, and CEPI, the Epidemic Preparedness and Innovation, the three partners put together what we call a global mechanism to allow countries to be able to access vaccines once they become available, and this is super important, so that countries don't have to rush and do, trying to do any deals with any manufacturers, because they are afraid they are not going to get vaccines. That could work for countries who are big countries, but even big countries have limited resources many times, right? So what we are expecting, we call it the COVAX facility. We have 190 countries who have joined this facility. And this facility has already agreements, commitments from manufacturers, from different manufacturers, for up to 2 billion doses until the end of this year, with also an option to have up to 3 billion doses by the end of the year. So what the stage we are in right now, WHO is working with the manufacturers who will provide the vaccines to the COVAX facility to do the emergency use listing. So we are expecting to have the first doses reaching countries end of February. So and the message that we're putting out, no one needs to panic because you're going to get a vaccine. According to, countries will get vaccines according to the priority populations, because in our Director General, he said very strongly during the executive board a couple of days ago that it's actually a moral imperative that we should not have young people who are not at higher risk of dying or of this disease receiving vaccines before people who have a higher risk of dying in all countries are receiving this vaccine. So this is super important at this moment. So we are expecting that in the first trimester, we'll have the flow of these vaccines running into countries. We're working very closely with these 190 countries.
Thank you very much. And our LinkedIn viewer is asking, with our efforts to support countries to distribute vaccines, are we taking into account their different localized contexts, because these vaccines need to be stored, some of the vaccines need to be stored on a very, very low temperature. So how we are supporting countries to prepare for deployment of vaccines?
Sure. I mean, that's what we've been doing for the last several months. So again, working with Gavi, with our partners like UNICEF and others, who help us to deploy vaccines on the ground, we've been looking at country readiness. And there are a number of different work streams there. Countries need to do lots of things, from training the workforce to having a national policy and a prioritization plan to thinking about where and how they're going to do vaccination, the cold chains, the supply chain, the risk communication, getting people prepared. And so all of that work, plus there's regulatory work, there's indemnification, because these vaccines are being rolled out through emergency use listing. There are some legal things that need to be put in place. So we've been working with countries to get ready and to get prepared. And certainly one of the considerations is which are the vaccines that are going to be easier to use. So countries have also been asked to express their preferences for which vaccines they would like to get, and also what are the timelines, how long is it going to take them to prepare. We don't want to ship very scarce vaccines to a country that's not even ready to start vaccinating. So all of those things are being worked out, and we're hoping the COVAX facility will be able to start distributing vaccines in February, starting from February onwards.
And it makes it more important because we know we have vaccines that are difficult to manage locally, right? If you need a minus 60 to minus 90 degrees conservation, even rich countries have problems right now with the logistics of it. So this is why it's so important what Soumya was saying before, that we need to make sure that these vaccines that are reaching phase 3 trial and that are concluding, that they are available, because many of them can be maintained in the local. When we say cold chain, we are talking about how the vaccine is refrigerated. And the ideal vaccine is refrigerated in the regular fridge, right? Doesn't need this ultra cold freeze, So it's so important right now that the more vaccines come, and that's why, and so that we can make sure that countries can manage the logistics of making the vaccine reach the health center and reach people who are prioritized more easily.
Thank you very much. Few viewers are asking if we can repeat or share information on what do we know at the moment about efficiency rates of different vaccines that have been used around the world.
Yes. So we know that for the Pfizer and the Moderna vaccines, they were close to 95%, 94 to 95%. And this is efficacy in preventing symptomatic disease, which means we still don't know how well they protect against asymptomatic infection. For some of the other vaccines, we've seen incomplete data or press releases. So it's hard to really say, and that's why I think we have to wait for a little while longer. We're examining the dossiers. As Mariângela said, several companies have submitted their packages to us with efficacy and safety data. So we will be able to provide information on that. But so far, whatever results have come out from the trials in the public domain, it looks like most of the vaccines have an efficacy of greater than 50%, which was our benchmark. So that is very promising. And most of them do have efficacy of over 70%. But again, we are expecting more results soon.
And if anyone wants to follow up how this is developing, WHO has an excellent COVID page. It's who.int, and has a go to the COVID page. And there you find everything, because we are being super transparent, right? We know not only you have information about which vaccines, there's a draft landscape of which vaccines are in research and development right now, at which stage they are, but you can also check which stage they are in WHO's assessment for the emergency use listing. This is all on the COVID page at who.int.
Thank you very much. Some of our viewers are asking, are we aware of infection, of some cases of infection after being vaccinated so far?
Yes, so, to get protective antibodies, it takes a little bit of time. So once you're vaccinated, and most of the vaccines currently that are being deployed need 2 doses. So the full protection comes after the second dose. So there are instances of people getting infection after the first dose, and there probably will be a few people getting infection after the second dose because none of the vaccines are 100% protective. So that shouldn't worry us. I think what's really good and what's unexpected is that the vaccines so far have shown such high efficacy and protection. So, of course, there's still lots of questions. How long does the protection last? We don't know. We have to follow them up. But hopefully, the chances are that from studies of people who've had the natural infection, most of them seem to have enough antibodies to protect them from getting a reinfection. Because if you look around the world, almost 100 million documented infections, but very few reinfections being reported. And there was a very good study recently from the UK which followed up healthcare workers. And if you had a previous infection, then the protection from a reinfection was about 85%. So we're thinking similar to vaccines. So all that is encouraging news. It means that we probably will have a little bit of long-lasting immunity, but how many years, those questions we still need to do the studies.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for your time and sharing all the work that's been done, not just in WHO, but around the world to ensure that vaccines, but also other tools against COVID-19 are safe, as that's what worries a lot of people. And they've been asking, how did we manage to get these products out there in a short period of time? I also thank all our viewers watching us from India, Mauritius, Nigeria, Vietnam, Germany, Philippines, Namibia, the US, the UK, France, Switzerland, Singapore, Zimbabwe, Australia, Ghana, DRC, Netherlands, Niger, Bhutan, and many others. Thank you for your questions. Mariângela invited you to follow our webpage for all the updates on new products or the current ones, in which stage of development or assessment they are, and also follow our social media channels for latest information. I would just remind everyone, as you mentioned, that even though we have vaccines being deployed in some countries, we still need to follow other measures such as physical distance, to wear a mask, to clean our hands, to avoid crowds, to open windows. And for those who are asking again why we are not wearing masks, we are sitting more than a meter apart from each other in a very well ventilated room. So that's the reason we could talk to each other without masks today. Thank you very much, and stay safe.